Thank you very much for being here with us. My name is Peymana Assad, and I'm a councillor in the London Borough of Harrow. I'm also the co-founder and co-chair of the Labour Foreign Policy Group. The Labour Foreign Policy Group is a member-led organisation working on foreign policy issues of the day. We hope to push the Labour Party towards more progressive thinking, and we're very interested in connecting global issues to local communities. If you want to find out a little bit more about us, you can find us on our website or at Labour FPG on Twitter. And as an international party, one of our values is solidarity, and within solidarity it means learning from each other, learning best practice about how we win power but also how we stay in power. And that means, centre-left parties really making life-changing policies for people in local communities. But this doesn't come without challenges, and those challenges are widespread, from domestic to international challenges, to winning working-class voters, to the changing culture within centre-left parties and the Labour Party, and the changing leadership styles. But also, as we heard from Cllr just a few minutes ago, this question of hope versus cynicism. And with me today, we have a very esteemed panel who are going to help us understand a little bit more about these challenges, but also how we win power and retain power. I'm going to introduce each speaker before they do their 5-minute introductory remarks. And then after that, we'll take some questions from the audience before we have some closing remarks. First of all, I'd like to introduce Will Marshall, who's on my left. He's the president and founder of the PPI, the Progressive Policy Institute, and the PPI remains the centre of intellectual architects for the modernisation of progressive politics. Will is the editor and co-editor of many books, including Memos to the New President, the AmeriCorps Experiment, and the Future of National Service, amongst others. And obviously, this is a short biography. There is lots of experience that Will has. Over to you, Will.
Thank you very much, Peymana. Thank you first of all, to Progressive Britain, our partners in this. We're very proud to partner with Nathan and company, Progressive Britain. And if I just may say, what a wonderful speech we just heard. It was service, respect, and stability. I'll take that back with me. Let me say just a few words about Progressive Policy Institute, because you probably don't know much about us. We're a think tank that's been in Washington for 3 decades. We kind of earned our spurs working back with Bill Clinton back in the 90s. And our mission continues to be to develop radically pragmatic ideas that help the Democratic Party in the United States compete everywhere, all over the map. And you've seen our maps. They're red and they're blue, and the country seems as divided, more divided than any time since the Civil War. Our mission is to break that by helping our party become more competitive in these places where they become no-go zones for Democrats, in effect. We also, as Peymana has said, have had a long engagement with the Labour Party and with other center-left parties. Our engagement with Labour goes back to John Smith and Patricia Hewitt, whom I met back when we were just getting started, and took much inspiration from. And it led to wonderful dialogues throughout the 90s and the aughts with Labour, with continental parties, with German parties, Florian, and all over the world. Eventually, we got to South America, and this was an amazing conversation that sparked all kinds of fascinating and mutually supportive cross-fertilizations of ideas and political strategies. And I don't think we'd ever seen a moment like this where center-left parties around the world were getting together, comparing notes, comparing ideas, and drawing inspiration from each other. It was a remarkable moment. And I feel that we're at another moment of center-left ferment and revival. And one of the PPI has had the great good fortune, and me personally, to meet Cllr Ainsley over the last several years of watching the Labour's come back under Mr. Starmer. And we were fortunate enough to get her to agree to come over with us and start a center-left renewal project. And we've just gotten back from Australia. We've been to Germany. We'll be traveling all over the world once again on this mission of fomenting a dialogue and solidarity among center-left parties. Now more than ever, we need a strong and confident center-left to turn back the tide of reactionary populism and nationalism that's still surging around the world. Back in my country, we still have Donald Trump lurking like a hammerhead shark just offshore, could come back at any moment and haunt us. So, the threat has not receded from our point of view. Things will look a lot better in this country than ours. But we think that the center-left parties need to aim higher than just winning by default, winning on the basis of how terrible our opponents are, even when they are. Because in our case, at least, we're too small. The Democratic Party is locked in a virtual tie with the Republicans, and we've really got to expand our social base. And what I heard Keir Starmer say just now was a formula for how to do that here. Let me quickly offer three brisk lessons from the U.S. experience that may be of value as labor and the leaders here think about the strategy and for coming back into power and governing. The first is that obviously, as we just heard, the policy ambition is absolutely essential, but it's got to be focused and disciplined and anchored in broad values that help people understand beyond or see beyond the complexities of policy. And what I just heard from your leader about mission focus was music to my ears, because so often parties come in and they overread their mandate. We saw a little of that, I'm sorry to say, with the Biden administration. We strongly support. But sometimes when you win elections, you are tempted to try to do everything at once. That delights your core supporters, your core partisans. It confuses and rattles swing voters across the persuadable middle. President Biden came in and was told that he could be the next Franklin Roosevelt and have a New Deal, and it got very, we sort of got ahead of ourselves, and we did a lot on a narrow margin, but there was a lot of spending that wasn't predicted, there wasn't talked about, campaigned upon. A lot of big programs, and that all contributed to inflation, which has become the top voter concern in the United States. And when the cost of living spikes, incumbents suffer. And just ask Rishi Sunak about that. Secondly, sometimes parties lose the ability to speak to the country as a whole, not just to our core partisans, and that's particularly a problem in the United States because we are so spatially separated. So if you're an average member of Congress, you are in a district that is plus Democratic by 15 points or plus Republican by 15 points, you lose the habit of speaking to people who don't already agree with you, and the muscles of political persuasion atrophy. We've had a lot of that in the United States on the Democratic side. We subscribed about 4 years ago to the myth of progressive ascendancy, that sort of a left-wing tendency was taking over the party, and the demographic trends, young voters, the growth in non-white voters, were going to inevitably deliver us a progressive majority. We found out that's not the case. You have to go out and build one. You have to go out and work for it, and that requires persuading and reaching across to the voters. We're not now reaching, and 49% of American voters now identify as independents, and the two parties claim about a quarter of the electorate. So people are seceding, or they're coming out of the two parties, and we need to learn to speak to those who do not now camp in the Democrats' tent. And thirdly, as we've just heard Keir Starmer put it so wonderfully, we need to renew our allegiance to the working class in the United States and the Democratic Party. It's the historical bedrock of our party, and frankly, we've drifted from it. The base of the Democratic Party nowadays is very educated, white, young urbanites, cosmopolitan folks. That's great. They're a great force in the party. But we have in the process of winning among the college educated, we have been losing among working class voters, and not just the white working class voters who adore Trump so much, but we've also seen hemorrhaging among minority voters, non-college voters. That's a big problem that we've got to struggle with. We have to grapple sincerely with the discontents that are driving right-wing populism and nationalism. And I'll close on this note. To me, that means two big things for U.S. Democrats. One is to embrace a politics of hope and aspiration, and maybe stop lecturing so much on the moral defaults of late-stage capitalism, and start talking about how we're going to improve the material conditions for working families. So we have to get back to the kitchen table and away from some of our beloved abstractions. And secondly, and this is a particular problem from us, I love when Keir Starmer said that this country's not ready for a cultural war. Unfortunately, the United States is mired in the middle of one. It's really a bad situation. And our party needs to learn how to embrace cultural moderation while making no compromises with nativism and with bigotry. But we also have our own extremist problems where we've gotten out over our skis on a lot of cultural issues that are problems for us that we've got to resolve. So I'll leave it there and just thank you very much for organizing this and for having us here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Will, for that context of the US. Now we're going to come to Claire Ainsley, who is the director of the PPI project on centre-left renewal at the Progressive Policy Institute. She was executive director of policy for Sir Keir Starmer and worked as an executive director for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. She is the author of The New Working Class, How to Win Hearts, Minds and Votes, which was published in May 2018. So please go and buy that book if you haven't already. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you, thank you. So as picking up from Will, really, I mean, we should be hugely encouraged, not just by our own results, but from this tentative revival of the centre-left, obviously in the United States, in Germany, Australia, Spain, and Portugal. So real encouragement, I think, for us. And I think we have to be honest about what's happened since the financial crisis, 2007 and 8. This sense that there was a centre to be revived didn't even feel like that over the last few years, and parties have either experienced often a decline in support, whether either they've been hit by either a form of right-wing populism or right-wing leaning populism, or depending on the voting system, being kind of compounded by a hit on the left as well. So the fact that there are now centre-left governments in those countries is hugely, hugely encouraging. I think if we are to understand how this revival is taking place and what we can learn from it, we have to understand the roots of our demise. And I think that crucially in this is that sense of the social democracy in that particular iteration not having brought about some of the economic change, which we absolutely have to be clear this time around we deliver. As Will touched on, that distance from working class voters, that is clearly at the core of Keir Starmer's strategy, but rightfully it's at the core of many of those parties too. There is nothing inevitable for us about the return of the centre-left. This is something which all of those countries, as Paul and Florian will explain, has absolutely been part of a strategy. So there is no pendulum that suddenly swings back our way. So we're all in this room because we're activists, because we care, because we campaign. But for the people that you're talking to, there is no inevitability about the return of the centre-left. And whilst we are seeing voters partly be put off by the extremities on the other side, there is a sense post-pandemic that voters are looking for more of those social democratic policies and platforms that come with providing that security as well as that optimism. But we also have to be clear that the right-wing populists there's still a big electoral presence. Their vote share is still rising in Europe. We've seen in the elections in Italy and Sweden that they are still attracting support. And the forces that took them there have not gone anywhere either. If anything, they've accelerated since their original rise. So we have to be mindful of all of this as we talk about revival. But as Will says, part of the work that we're doing now is looking at, well, what can we learn in the UK from this tentative revival of the centre-left around the world? And there's a number of different lessons, but partly it's understanding the electoral coalition that we need in order to win under the voting system we have in this country. And Keir, I thought, gave the clearest exposition of the project that I have heard from him ever. It is clearly about, in our system, reforging this historic coalition between the modern working class as it is today and the more liberal middle class, and it is that coalition that has always taken us into power. That realignment with working class voters, and I absolutely stress this is not just the traditional working class, this is the modern working class, it is multi-ethnic, more likely to be female, working in service industries. that historic realignment is the only way, in numbers terms, literally, for Labour to get back in. There has never been a narrow red wall strategy. It has always been about the places that Cllr has talked about and the people Cllr has talked about. So firstly, kind of getting that electoral coalition right, facing the voters. Secondly, we have to be honest about how unpopular leaders light and divisive Scott Morrison and Donald Trump are. So frame your opponent, crucial. As Will has touched on, we will talk about not overloading the platform. That is absolutely critical. I think the SDP in Germany have really shown, SPD, sorry, you can absolutely have this mission-driven moonshot goals of this is what a government should achieve, but the translation into really tangible pledges that are deliverable in practice and really mean something to people is crucial. And the leader, as Cllr is doing, being the leader of carrying that positive message, giving people hope, as well as giving people a reason not to vote for the other side. Ultimately, the test of whether there is a revival in this country or not, for all of us, is about whether we can deliver that economic change this time around that I referred to at the beginning. Our sister parties are showing with a solid platform around wages, around lowering costs, around public services, that was really resonating with people's desire for security after the pandemic. But we have to wrestle now with the tough questions of what's actually going to improve people's living standards, even if we have a streamlined platform going into the election. In Australia, they've just announced their budget, the Australian Labor government. They are saying they will have a return to surplus. They are providing assistance on the cost of living, and they're grappling with some of the economic structural issues that have caused lower growth in the first place. So I think we've got every chance of joining this revival, and wouldn't it be wonderful if we can, but it is not inevitable, but there is nothing short of our political, intellectual, our organisational renewal that is required for us to be part of it.
Thank you, Claire. We'll talk about the Australian Labor Party's win in a minute. We've got Paul on the screen with us. But I just want to come to Dr. Florian Ranft, who's the head of Green New Deal at Das Progressive Zentrum. He's a member of the management board and head of the Green New Deal. He focuses on inclusive growth and future of work. Previously, he was a researcher and lecturer in political sociology and international relations at the University of Frankfurt, and a word I cannot pronounce, a place I cannot pronounce, so maybe you can say where that is. Over to you, Dr. Florian.
Thanks so much. I'm hugely excited to be here, obviously, because when I first got here, which was just before the Brexit referendum, so please don't blame me, but you looked at the map of Europe, and talking about the rival of centre-left parties, you really had to look hard to find kind of in the mid-tens to find countries where we had progressive governments. At the time, believe it was only Malta and Sweden. So looking at it now and looking at the prospects maybe of Labour winning the elections here, when the stars might be aligned again between progressive governments in DC, London and Berlin and other important European capitals and across the world, that's something to work for and something to hope for. But let's talk a little bit about Germany, because Germany is a little bit in a funny place, talking about kind of challenges for the center-left and for progressives. We're now kind of 2 years in to having a progressive government, a coalition between the SPD, the Greens and the Liberal Party, and obviously it hasn't gone quite to how we imagined it to go. After 16 years of Merkel, the countries and the people in Germany were quite tired, not of what Merkel has done maybe internationally, because she had quite a high reputation, and obviously she was a well kind of renowned leader, but she, let's say, didn't quite do all of her homework back in Germany. People were tired of kind of the lack of digitalization. There's still a kind of high level of inequality. We still have one of the highest low-income sectors in Europe. So there was quite a lot to do for progressive parties and to build kind of a campaign agenda around 3 years ago. So talking about Germany, there's obviously the SPD, now with Scholz as the Chancellor, but there's also the Greens and the Liberals who ran that campaign and who connected basically something that Keir just put together in his service, respect and stability narrative and spanned it across the three parties. The SPD ran on promising a better future, so in a way kind of the hope narrative. They promised to deliver on the issue of respect, so something that Keir just spelled out, and they promised progress when it comes to Europe. And with these kind of three pillars of the campaign, they managed to convince voters, and they also managed to build kind of a broad coalition in the electorate. So the SPD at the time of the election in 2021 was quite strong in reaching out to working class voters, to voters in the structurally weak, or you may say kind of the left behind regions, and also with older voters, whereas the Green parties and the Liberals were quite strong with younger voters, with people who have kind of a stronger interest in progressing on climate issues, and for the FDP, the Liberals, with people who are more kind of business open, business minded, and want to drive an innovation agenda in Germany. Now, 2 years into this, pretty much at half term, Germany obviously finds itself, as most countries in Europe, in an entirely different situation, because the 2 first years were dominated by building kind of a response, a political response to what has happened in Ukraine. So Germany has basically been facing 3 problems most recently. The first one was it had outsourced its energy dependence to Russia. It has outsourced its economic growth to China, and it has outsourced its security and defense policy to the US. So now the government is kind of grappling with all the kind of 3 big challenges which affect not just the economy, but also obviously social protection and welfare in this country, and trying to build an agenda and tackling the kind of consequences of inflation, rising energy prices, which affect not just industries, but also kind of the population as a whole. And now they are also struggling with public finances, because a lot of money has been spent, 100 billion on security and defense, in order to build a stronger military and to send signals to its partners that it's willing not just to defend the moral values, but also in terms of military strength. And now we need to come together, and the coalition needs to come together to deliver on some of its other aspects. So maybe as one of the lessons, and I will close to this, I think if you look at the campaign trail, and if you look at Germany's kind of first 2 years, or the Progressives coalition's first 2 years in government, one good lesson for Labour is probably to kind of learn from the past, which Labour is doing already. But one important point might be from the German context is, I mean, we see, looking at the results of the local elections, that there's a wind of change blowing in the UK. But it's not just blowing in the direction of Labour, but it's also blowing in the direction of the Lib Dems and of the Greens. So Labour might be well advised, not publicly obviously, but to kind of strategically reach out to the other parties in case there is not an absolute majority by the time of the election, and to build kind of a broad coalition of progress that will deliver for the country. Thank you.
I'm sure we're going to get a lot of questions about what was said at the end around Lib Dems and the Greens. But I'm really honoured that we have Paul Erickson with us. He's virtually joining us. He is the permanent national secretary of the Australian Labor Party. He's been in the role since August 2019. And in his role, he's responsible for Labour's national campaigns in Australia. In 2022, last year, Paul was campaign director on Labour's successful federal election campaign, becoming the only fourth national secretary to lead a winning campaign from opposition. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Peymana. It's a great pleasure to be joining you at the conference today from all the way over here in Canberra. We're about 9 hours ahead of you in London, and hopefully not too far ahead of you in terms of enjoying life here under a Labor government. Thank you to Nathan and the team at Progressive Britain for the invitation to participate remotely, and it's great to be on the panel with friends and colleagues like Will and Claire and Florian, and really looking forward to the discussion over the next hour. I'll start by talking a little bit about the 2022 federal election. As Peymana said, Labor won that election just short of 1 year ago, on May the 21st of last year. The Australian people elected Labor, led by Anthony Albanese, and that was only the fourth time since the Second World War that our party had won government from opposition. And although it is nearly a year ago, I think in the first half of my opening observations, it would be worth just talking about why we believe Labor won. And the sort of core point that I'd like to emphasise there is that we won the election because we talked about the future and we offered Australians a choice that was built around our alternative to more of the same. And much like, as Florian said, the SPD or the SDP in Germany, the theme that we emphasised was the offer of a better future. So we campaigned on a very hopeful and optimistic narrative, talking about the opportunities that the country has that could be taken up if we had some new ideas and new energy and fresh leadership, and the problems that had built up under the coalition that required a new approach in order for the country to work together to solve them. And we built the choice between that better future or more of the same around a couple of themes that I want to talk about, and then one particular approach to campaigning that I think applies to all progressive and centre-left parties. So the first theme that we built that choice around was leadership. So after a decade of neglect under the coalition, we offered Australians the chance to elect a Prime Minister who would show up, would take responsibility, and would work with people to solve problems. And we made that approach to leadership central to our campaign. And we were fortunate in that under our former Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, we were in a very opportunity-rich environment in terms of drawing a contrast between that approach and how Mr. Morrison went about things. And we were able to build a contrast between a coalition that was stuck in the past, too slow to act and refused to take responsibility for the challenges facing Australia, and Anthony Albanese's style of leadership, which is to be a leader who will bring the country together, someone who can demonstrate from his experience and through his judgment that he truly is a safe pair of hands, and someone who tells it straight. And it's that model of building consensus rather than picking fights, which I think represents the way forward for progressives, particularly in the current moment after COVID. And I'll talk in a moment about how we've seen that play out in Australia in the first 12 months of government. The second theme that we built that offer of a better future around was an agenda for change that addressed the challenges facing working people in their own communities and their own lives. I really second both Will and Claire's comments about the need to make that agenda just absolutely tangible, built around kitchen table economics, and talk about the challenges that people face in their own lives in simple, clear terms, not in abstractions. And over the course of our campaign, voters gained a really clear sense of what the priorities of an Australian Labor government would be, which were to get wages growing, invest more in Medicare and healthcare to make it easier for people to see a doctor, to work with business to bring back manufacturing so that Australia can be a country that makes things again, and to invest in renewable energy, both to reduce emissions and face up to the challenge of climate change, but also to unlock the huge economic opportunities and jobs opportunities that can come from Australia becoming a renewable energy exporting superpower. The third element of our campaign that I think is worth highlighting is less of a question of sort of message and emphasis and more about strategy. And that is that we really took the lesson from some of our recent defeats that we needed to focus more on defining our opponents. And I think that progressive parties and campaigns should never shy away from defining our opponents on our terms. And our campaign, in a sense, sought to establish conditions where, for anyone who was still on the fence late in the campaign and hadn't made up their mind, the spectre of 3 more years of failed Conservative government under Scott Morrison was the biggest threat facing them and the country, particularly on the economy, where our Liberal National Coalition under Mr Morrison offered no plan to get wages moving, had no plan to tackle the cost of living crisis, and no vision for the long term or for the future of our economy. We're now 12 months on from the election and we're well into the reality of governing. So just a couple of observations about what I think has been interesting about the last 12 months and some of the lessons that we've learnt. I mentioned earlier that I think we really are in a moment where the style of leadership that people are looking for is one that builds consensus and works with people to solve problems rather than creating conflict and picking fights and try to draw dividing lines and divide up the community. And one of the pieces of consistent feedback that we get from the Australian community about the first 12 months of the government is just how refreshing it is to feel like the adults are back in charge, and like the quality that our national leadership is bringing to government and to the national conversation is one of just trying to quietly work with people and solve problems rather than pick fights. And I think that points to a longer term challenge facing progressive parties everywhere, which is the need for us to rebuild trust in institutions and rebuild faith in politics itself. Progressive politics is motivated by our vision to make real change on behalf of the people that we represent, and we can't achieve that if there isn't underlying in the conversation about the choices facing our countries a belief in the legitimacy of and the power of government to make changes. And so that is part of a longer term agenda that we're really focused on, and that is very important to Anthony Albanese as our Prime Minister, which is just to try to restore faith and rebuild trust in politics. Secondly, as Claire said, this week our Treasurer Jim Chalmers handed down a federal budget, the second budget that the government's had the opportunity to produce after bringing down our first budget in October, which we brought forward after we were elected. And I think 2 things stood out about this week's budget. The first was it was a genuine Labor budget. We're investing in Medicare. The centrepiece of the budget that was announced on Tuesday night by Jim was a huge investment in Medicare, designed to fix the problems that we've inherited with primary healthcare access becoming harder and harder for communities around the country, and deliver on the promise to make it easier to see the doctor. The second big ticket item in the federal budget was really substantial cost of living relief to help working Australians and help see them through the cost of living crisis that Australia is currently facing, and rebuild our safety net without fueling inflation. That gets me to the second thing that stood out about the budget, which is it was a very responsible budget in uncertain times. And over the course of our first 12 months in government and over those two budgets, 87% of improvements to government revenue from higher than expected commodity prices and low unemployment have been allocated by this government towards the budget bottom line rather than being spent. And by being responsible in those terms over the course of the first 12 months, we are actually able to deliver a surplus this week in the second budget. But we're also being upfront with Australians about the structural challenges facing the federal government's budget, which are going to reassert themselves over the next few years, which in conclusion, I think just takes me back to that earlier point about leadership and the importance for us on the centre left to remember that it is authenticity and honesty and that sort of brand of leadership that Anthony is bringing to Australia, and that I think that Cllr has is demonstrating, and if he was successful and was in number 10, would really be able to bring to government that is at the core of the Progressive project. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that blueprint on how we win the next election, I guess, for the Labour Party. We've heard a lot about building coalitions and this point about building hope. And I just want to come back on this rebuilding trust with the electorate, getting the votes to actually win power. We've heard from the US, Germany, Australia, but here in the UK, we're trying to win back power. And I want to come to you, Claire, first. How do we rebuild that trust when people feel, as Cllr said, that so much is going wrong? And should they really believe that change is possible?
Yeah, I think it's probably the most important question for us, and I suspect a lot of us experience this out on doorsteps. The mood has shifted. It has shifted from where it was. I definitely felt there being genuinely more warmth towards Labour. I think Florian's right, and we should talk about it. There was a big move against the Tories, and then how do you capitalise on that? I think part of what we've heard so far this morning does give us some of the indications of how we do it. I mean, I think we have to recognise how deep the crisis in trust is. It's happening everywhere. It's partly why the populists are winning. My central answer on that is our side have to have better answers that are credible and deliverable on how we are going to improve the lives of working people in this country, and that is about clear pledges fundamentally on economic change. Like, I think the economic and the cultural and the social really, really matter, but ultimately, unless we can do that hard work of answering how this complex economy, we are going to improve wages, lower costs, and give people better security and opportunity. Unless we can answer that central dilemma, I think, of social democrats, then I don't think we will win people's trust back. In terms of in the campaign, I think we've heard some of the things that we can do in opposition. So having a really crystal clear, streamlined pledge into government. And when we were in Australia, I asked lots of people, did that prevent you from being as bold or reformist as you wanted to be in power? And they said no. They claimed a mandate quickly, and the reforms the Albanese government are now seeing through are absolutely as ambitious as they wanted to be. So being credible in terms of our promises. And then I think there's something that Paul touched on around the style of leadership. So the style of leadership that we are seeing being modelled by Keir Starmer, I think really majors on this. We are not punching down here. We are bringing people together under these missions. And I think we will have to have an agenda in government about rebalancing and restoring those institutions. It's not the thing that's going to go on the pledge card, but I think it is absolutely important, and it's been used to our detriment in the culture wars, be it the BBC or some of our great institutions. So I think we have to have an actual trust agenda whilst in a government, not just around politics, but around the wider cultural frame, which has been so desecrated really by the Conservatives.
Thank you very much. Will, obviously, Joe Biden won his election campaign on being an alternative to Donald Trump. But it was also about building trust again in politics, especially after January 6th, and so on and so forth. How do you think, from learning from the US context, that the UK Labour Party can do the same?
Well, Joe Biden he ran as somebody who was going to save the country, frankly, from Donald Trump, and probably won on that basis. But he helped his own cause by talking about being the president for all America, not just, he wasn't just talking to Democrats. He was telling Donald Trump supporters and Republican voters and independents, who I said are the largest body of voters now, that he was not going to be a narrow partisan leader. What did Keir Starmer just tell us? Country over party, and that he was going to govern for the whole country and not just for his party. And that was a resonant theme. People wanted, as Paul said, it's not only that you have to rebuild trust in your party, but you have to rebuild trust in politics. And particularly in our country, which is so terribly polarized, among two parties that essentially don't see the other party as legitimate. There's a legitimacy crisis. So the middle ground in American politics has been scorched beyond recognition. So, great leaders do have to be bigger than their parties in a sense, and they've got to stand for enduring national values and principles, as well as the good, principles that inform their party's agendas. And so I think, as I kind of alluded to it in my opening remarks, that the president maybe drifted away from that toward a more partisan message in 2021, outsourced a lot of his budget policy to our good friends on the left of the party, and the result of that was a bigger spending package than voters were led to believe was coming down the pike, and I would argue maybe a loss of focus and discipline of the kind that we've just heard from Paul and Cllr and others that is really important here. Lastly, leaders have to inspire confidence in people, and unfortunately, ours are now, sort of tearing down the other part. Negative partisanship is the ruling principle of American political competition, where you almost cease to make the positive case for your own party and make the negative case for the other party. Fortunately, the Democrats haven't fallen into that. That's the Trump formula and recipe, and we've got to stick to our recipe and inspire hope that it doesn't have to be like this. And I think that Joe Biden will go back to that kind of message in his re-election campaign.
Thank you very much, Will. So we've heard a lot about coalitions, and I think that's what Will was also discussing, this partisan messaging and building a broader coalition. And if we look at Germany, that is what Germany's currently experiencing. How do we learn from those coalition buildings to try and rebuild trust within our institutions and our politics so that the UK Labour Party can win power again?
Yeah, I think when we talk about this kind of crucial issue of trust, I think we've already, mentioned that there's kind of some short-term, kind of measures that we can take, especially when you talk about political leadership, Scholz coming in, Biden coming into the office, and people have the feeling like, do I trust this guy to steer the ship in these hard times and through these rough kind of tides at the moment or not? But then on the other hand, there's these kind of long-term kind of, issues that we've basically been observing since, the global financial crisis, that the erosion of trust in politics is not so much, happening in the big metropolitan centers, but it's kind of like, out in the communities that are kind of distant from London, DC, Berlin, and so on and so forth. And building coalitions to kind of tackle these kind of long-term trust issues, I think what we've seen in Germany now is that firstly, people who are kind of not part or living in, the left behind regions or structurally weak regions, as we say them, they have the feeling that they are not benefiting, from all the fancy stuff maybe that we're talking about the energy transition and about kind of, innovation and new tech. So to build kind of coalitions, it's really important that we reach out to these people and not just talk about it, but we find kind of tangible, policies and ways of making politics, of how to build these coalitions that are currently kind of dividing our societies. And there are two ways of how we can do that. The first one is obviously to kind of credibly commit to investments and finances, and not just rhetorically talk about them, as the Tories maybe have done here with their levelling up agenda, but to actually commit a solid kind of financial structure and framework that will help not just the metropolitan areas but also other areas in this country. And the second one is probably even more important. We have to kind of find ways of how to do politics differently and build coalitions in the communities to engage people and to have a conversation with them about the future of their regions and of the places where they live. This is crucial for progressives, because this is how we can actually reconnect to what we talked about, building prosperity and prospects for the working class. But it's also crucial for our countries and for balancing the big regional inequalities that have been building up since the globalization has kicked in and the global financial crisis.
Thank you very much, Florian. Paul, we've heard a lot about leadership style, partisan messaging, and reaching out to the left behind. And you spoke a lot about this rebuilding trust as a long-term challenge. But I guess Australia's Labour Party actually did that because you won power back. What's the one lesson you think that the Labour Party, I mean, you did give us a blueprint, but what's the one lesson that you think UK Labour can learn from the Australian Labour Party on winning back that trust?
Thanks, Peymana. Obviously, every country's institutional setup is different, and we are a federation in Australia. So even when we've been out of power federally, as we were for 9 years leading up to last year's election, we had the benefit or the advantage of being in government at a number of in a number of our states and territories, our premiers and chief ministers who had led their jurisdictions through the pandemic were particularly credited with leading the public health response and keeping people safe and healthy throughout COVID, which made the debate about the future of the country after the pandemic quite interesting, because over the course of those 2 years in 2020 and 2021, people's horizons had really shifted in and had really come in, and local had come much more to the forefront. So one of the challenges we found when we were putting together a national election campaign was that people's sense of our two major parties, what they stood for and what they were about, varied quite greatly across the country depending upon who'd been in power at a subnational level throughout the pandemic. And we found a way by talking about that leadership style of bringing people together to turn that to our advantage by saying that Anthony Albanese, as a Labor Prime Minister, would work with premiers and chief ministers from both political persuasions and would just try to solve problems and get things done. We were also able to build on the sort of credible, deliverable pledges. When we were thinking about our policy offering, we were able to build on people's lived experience of what had happened in their own jurisdictions under state and territory Labor governments, and essentially try to build on people's positive experiences with Labor and make that a building block of a larger picture. So when I think about the United Kingdom, obviously you're not a federation the way we are in Australia, but with devolution to the nations and also with local and regional government, I think there's an opportunity for Labor to build connections at the local level that you connect up to the national story that Cllr is telling about what a national renewal could look like under a Labor government nationally.
Still working? Yes. We now have some time for some questions, and I'm going to take them in threes. Please be short, don't make speeches, questions, and say your name and organisation or where you're from. We have the lady here in the middle, and the man with the glasses over there, and you in the front here. Have a microphone.
Hi. Hello. Thank you. Hi, my name is Amina Ali. I'm the deputy leader of the Labour group in Tower Hamlets. Claire, I read your book and it was a breath of fresh air because for the first time it was a book that actually addressed modern working class Britain and looked at the fact that working class people are diverse and it's not just the original theory of a white working class community. Now, my question, therefore, now is looking at Labour's offer for the middle-class diverse communities, because we don't talk enough about the black and the ethnic minority middle-class community in Britain, which also exists. The Tories are kind of doing quite a lot of work with that community, and the majority of them are well-educated communities who no longer associate with the working-class diverse communities, but also have uniqueness within the middle class, if that makes any sense. So I'm not hearing at all Labour's offer on this. And it'd be interesting, Will, if you could talk about America, which has a massive American middle class from the diverse communities, and what lessons Labour in the UK can learn from what the Democrats have been doing there.
Thank you very much, Amina. The gentleman there with the glasses? Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry, we've all got glasses, bit confusing. Thanks. My name's Dennis McShane. I'm going on Monday to France for 3 days to study why the French left is in such a lamentable state. Little focus groups, meeting François Hollande downwards. And I think we need more micro studies of how other countries are working or not working, rather than sort of vague generalizations. In particular, to just pinch the best policies, and I'm sure every one of our friends, Paul and Will, of course, could give us one policy that works. For example, go up to Tottenham Court Road Station. I'll take the Elizabeth line over to Paddington this afternoon to appear on GB News and attack Sunak. Boo, boo. But in France, there are 8 Elizabeth lines. Go to Germany, look at their Pflegeversicherung insurance system for old age care. Been around now for 20 years. It really works and it solves the problem. Go to Switzerland, where every child who's not going to university gets an apprenticeship. So just steal good ideas from around the world and worry a little bit less about the fact. What's my question, Ken? All right, my old press officer at Community News saying, what's the question? Can Labour do that? Steal specific ideas that work from other countries, and at some stage between now and the next 20 years, mention the E word, the elephant word, Europe.
And unfortunately, because of time, this is going to be the last question. Sorry, the person in the middle here, right in the front. White T-shirt. Oh, shirt, sorry.
Thank you. I'm William, and I wanted to just ask is how much, because there's so many different social groups that have to be moulded in order to make a successful electoral coalition, and you've got so many different groups where young people want quite a lot, want one thing, and yet people from older backgrounds want something different. What is the most successful way that you've seen and experienced from other countries that Labour could use to build a successful coalition that breaches the age barrier, which is one of the biggest issues, particularly in the UK with the ageing population?
Thank you very much. So I'm going to start from this end. Florian, if you want to take any other questions, I'm guessing the one on the coalitions, but alternatively, stealing policies from around the world, or how do we appeal to the middle class?
Okay, let's start with the stealing policies from the world. I mean, you mentioned, if I understand correctly, you mentioned, for instance, the insurance system that's kind of working in Germany. and so on and so forth. I think the issue is, obviously, these would be kind of huge institutional reforms that the UK has to undertake. So there will be, I think it's, probably useful to think about it in terms of kind of opportunities. So at which point, do kind of opportunities arise to build kind of a credible kind of platform around it? You also mentioned the E word, so Europe. So for instance, Europe will be steering towards, when there will be a solution for the war in Ukraine maybe on the table, Europe will have to ask itself, who are we? What are our morals and our norms, and who's part of the club, basically. So there might be, an opportunity here for the UK also to bring this agenda and bring Europe back on the kind of domestic political agenda and strengthen ties with Europe and talk about maybe some institutions in the future, not about rejoining, but, what is possible, what can be done. So, how can we steal them, and how can these big things, or these big reforms be undertaken in the UK will always, depend on kind of, timing and moment and opportunities. So you'll probably have to wait and be patient, and then be there, with the white papers and with the work you've done, and bring them into the public and political discourse.
Thank you very much. Claire, do you want to take this question on reaching out to the middle class?
Yeah, so I'll keep it to that because I know we're tight on time. So basically, in our so thank you for your comments. In our system, we have to go like big coalition. So therefore, like Cllr doesn't talk specifically about like working class people. You've got to go broader than that because of who we need to appeal to. So I think our overall, like we have to be really targeted. Like the Tories did this for years. They worked out exactly what groups they got alongside them. And Sunak actually led that as a backbencher. We absolutely have to do that piece that is understanding deeply each of the communities that we are becoming of and for, but our overall stance has to be, as Cllr is doing, like pro-aspiration, pro-opportunity, and being quite mainstream on social and cultural issues. There's the general, but there's also the specific work we do, so I totally agree with you.
Thank you. Will?
Well, just on that question, I agree with Claire, and we have something in America, the diploma divide, that's very important. It really helps explain the way our politics are configured and the shape and composition of the two parties. And we're grappling with, we're doing very well with college voters. We're not doing well with non-college voters, and that particularly Black, Hispanic, and Asian non-college voters. And they just, they have different views than college-educated whites. And so we're trying to understand those differences. There's an ideological difference of about 20 points. They're more moderate, frankly, more socially conservative. If I may, just to this gentleman's question about learning from others, that's what we're doing. And so when I was down in Australia, Paul, we spent some time talking to folks about the apprenticeship program there, because the biggest idea, the best idea that we are working on at PPI to help us connect with our working class voters where we're not, where we have a real challenge, is creating a system of skilling for them that is as robust and as reliable and as affordable, as college. We have a wonderful college system in the U.S., but most people don't use it. 60% of young people don't get college degrees, and we have a crappy system of job training. It's just a patchwork of bad programs. So no wonder working people aren't hearing us, because they don't think we care about their kids and their aspirations and their upward mobility. So getting up, with an apprenticeship to the same levels that Britain and Australia and Germany have is one of our top goals. So we're out there trying to learn how you all have done it.
Thank you very much, Will. Paul, if you could also, amongst answering some of these questions, also give us one word that the UK Labour Party can take away to win the next election.
No pressure. Well, I'll answer Dennis's question, I think, and I've got two ideas for you, Dennis. The first, we took a policy to the election called the National Reconstruction Fund. I know you've got Maria Mazzucato presenting today. In fact, I think possibly in the next session. The National Reconstruction Fund is a finance vehicle that the Commonwealth government has set up that will make loans and equity investments and offer guarantees to businesses connected with 7 priority areas, priority missions that we've identified, which included, which are where we want to build our new industrial and manufacturing base. So renewables and low emission technologies, medical science, transport, and a few of the other challenges facing the country. I think it's a model that has worked in Australia through our Clean Energy Finance Corporation that the last Labor government set up under Minister Greg Combay in 2011, which is one of the few pieces of climate and energy policy infrastructure that survived the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison government and has been very successful in driving investment in renewables in Australia. And we're now looking at that model across other parts of the economy, very much informed by Maria's thinking about what mission-centred government can look like. And we sold that in the campaign in very simple terms as working with business to bring back manufacturing so that Australia can make things again. So we didn't go out and talk in that sort of wonky policy terms on the doorstep. We talked about it in terms that people understood, that just like used common sense, down to earth language to describe and sell the policy. One word to think about what Labor needs to do to win the election. Well, I'm fond of LBJ's admonition that if you do everything, you will win. So my one word is to try.
And that's a great word to end on. I just want to thank Will, Claire, Florian, and Paul for their time and for giving us their expertise and understanding. Please join me in thanking them.